There's a very strong picture of the mathematical web of the soul, as it were, in the Euthyphro. Plato gives a very extreme example, which may have the benefit of giving us a quartz crystal clear vision of something which indeed one can see why through only meditative rational vision one would wonder whether indeed there weren't a part of the psyche, or the Greek psychology, the soul, that were wholly independent and didn't either belong to the body or pass away in the hurly-burly of the world, as do all bodies. Whether or not the law of conservation of matter is true or not doesn't straightforwardly affect that. I put in some kind of parentheses or whatnot, but or on in a footnote, let's say, to that. But putting that aside, let's look at the direct the dialogue. So the example is, assuming it's an invention. I don't know if anybody claims Euthyphro is a actual historical figure, but it's quite a fantastic case, because if you begin by thinking of murder as the most extreme crime, or let's say the worst crime, the case is that there's a murderer who's also, in addition, a slave of some country people who aren't that well to do themselves. Slave servant, the word wasn't translated exactly if we're thinking through the lens of antebellum American South or something. But so this slave servant has committed murder. Euthyphro's father ties him up and leaves him in a ditch. He does duly send somebody to go get the constable from town, but in the meantime, the tied up murderer freezes to death, or somehow he dies of exposure. Maybe it's too much sun, I don't remember. Euthyphro concludes that manslaughter or murder is manslaughter or murder, even if the victim is somebody who is known to have committed a murder, although untried and hadn't been tried yet, and even if it's his own father who has to go on trial for the manslaughter or murder. It's about as extreme a case as can be devised. It has a mathematical quality in that sense, but I think the immediate recognition that this is in some sense the right conclusion is where, as we're speaking about a matter of reason, and we're speaking about a matter of a dictate of law, so we can see clearly the meaning of ratio, or something along those lines, right reason. We're dealing with what later on could be called a moral issue if it's taken out of the mathematical icy sphere. But one can certainly see how that conclusion, and then you could think about it, quite a few people would be able to see that conclusion as the most extreme, but also the right conclusion of reason. It reminds us of Zizek's sort of attempt to go into full materials reason mode in his comment that if his son were to die and then he found out the son didn't have any pain during dying, he would say, well, okay, let's go out to lunch, no problem. Somehow some argument like that could follow in out of what's the right behavior in extreme rationalism. But this, it has a more flavor of reason, simple. It's like, yes, the good citizen should ignore all these other factors. And then we have this notion of not just the notion, but this phenomena, that people sometimes know what the right opinion is to say, And there might be somebody like Euthyphro who would just say that, but then when they were with their closest friends or their family, they wouldn't advise them the same way. They'd say, no, no, we can't put your father on trial for this. It doesn't make any sense, and so on. So we have to cover this up. Whatever. It's clear that something like that could come to be the public opinion, and yet there would be a second order, Gemeinschaft, or your close associates, where you wouldn't really believe that. Um, that's a very interesting contrast. On the one side, the Gemeinschaft is like history and historicism. On the other side, we have the verdict of rect ratio, or reason understood as what anyone can understand if they're brought to it with candidness and allowed to see it. And this figure of this kind of reasoning seems to stand independent. It's supposed to be accessible to the higher part, to nous, the very highest part of the Greek psychology, and one can see how it seems to be a freestanding object, just as I said, just as mathematical objects like the ratio of the diameter to the circumference of a circle seem, as we determine it, as pi, but as people used to say in former times, as one third. These kind of things seem to have an independence, and not just from any person, but somehow the idea would be, just as the things we see with vision exist on their own, the things that the mind sees in whatever region that is, not the mind, but nous, the highest part of the suke sees in whatever region it's in, would also have an independent existence. And then you get here this issue of the identification of reason in this sense, which nonetheless remains totally within the region of accessibility from opinion, or the lower part of that example. It's accessible, they can see it, but they don't accept it. This reason is totally within the sphere of daily life. It's the view of the professor rather than the view on the streets, perhaps, as would be another metaphor. So we can see how that notion of reason has radically decayed from that time. But my primary purpose just here was just to make that little prism, which gives us a quick look at the sort of mathematical and, as it were, objective in a certain sense, vision of reason in the beginning of the Euthyphro.